The notice reached the cadet barracks just before noon, flash-coded across the common wall with a tone that set teeth on edge. Rowan Hale was oiling the hinge on his field knife when the tone cut through the room, clean and metallic, and every conversation flattened into a hush. A line of text unfolded in pale blue glyphs, translated a heartbeat later into standard. Next, survival evaluation, off-world deployment, minimal kit, desert environment. Someone swore in a language that clicked like pebbles in a jar. Someone else laughed a little too loudly and then fell quiet when the mission seal appeared, the seal that meant the instructors would not intervene unless death became unavoidable. Rowan slid the knife home and dried his hands on the hem of his shirt. The air in the room felt drier just reading the brief. He did not smile, and he did not scowl. He only breathed and watched the way dust motes spun in the light from the upper windows, as if a desert wind already pushed through the vents. The staging platform lay above the primary launch ring, a clean plane of composite that hummed underfoot with the voice of buried generators. Heat shimmered in illusion along the far edge where a desert moon hung as a sphere of ochre and white on the hangar display. Zephra 5, someone whispered, and the name moved along the line like a chill inside a collar. Zephra 5 had a reputation inside the academy, and reputation mattered almost as much as physics. Rowan had not set foot on that moon, but he had read the debriefs, the autopsies, and the small, mean footnotes about equipment losses that bled budgets dry. The cadets formed ranks by cohort and species, a colorful disorder that the academy nonetheless called discipline. Tower-bodied arthropods clicked their leg guards against the deck in a rhythm that never quite matched human steps. Winged gliders tucked enamel wings tight against spine ridges, careful to keep fragile edges away from armor seams. Vine walkers shifted weight from foot to hand as if the floor might suddenly become a wall. Rowan stood in the human column with 3 others, but even inside that column he felt solitary. That was not loneliness. That was a kind of clarity he had learned early. Inside a test, no one else could share the inside of his skull. Commander Celix walked out from the shade of the landing pylons with a stride that made the crowd settle. She had a face carved by a desert sun and hair pinned into a dark knot that did not move when she did. Master Sergeant Core kept pace at her shoulder, a broad-shouldered shadow whose expression said he had nothing left to prove. Celix did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The platform held sound like a drum, and the 100 different heartbeats on it seemed to slow when she spoke. The drill, she said, would be 30 hours dock to dock. The test proper would last from late afternoon on Zephra 5 through the night into pale morning. The rules held as always. No prefab shelters, no full-face shields outside emergency use, no deployment of auto barricades. Each cadet would carry a field knife, a length of rope, a water canister, and 2 nutrient bars. A basic med patch in case skin went to blood. No more. Rescue drones would orbit. Rescue drones would not land unless cardiac telemetry demanded intervention. She let that sit. Sandstorm bands moved across the moon with a speed that defeated short-range forecasts. The storm would come. The instructors had selected a window that made it statistically likely to hit in the night. Rowan drifted 1 gaze length past Celix toward the big board that showed weather in false color, and he watched the thin threads of forecast probability lace and dissolve. He could almost hear his father's voice from the long ago of arid canyons on Earth, a patient murmur that lived in muscle memory more than in words. Look first. Touch last. He remembered a summer where heat turned road tar soft and saguaros threw green spears at a white sky. He remembered a park ranger who showed a cross-section of a cactus rib and talked about fibers and water and pressure so calm a child could fall asleep to it. He did not think of comfort when he remembered. He thought of structure, of the way living matter took a hostile place and made it survivable by being patient and exact. Core handled the practicals. He ticked off safety limits. He held up the kit bag and shook it so that a knife, a coil of line, and the glint of a canister flashed in the light. He pointed at the med patch with 2 fingers and called it the last resort between pride and a body bag. Some of the cadets laughed when he said that. He did not. He spoke as if he had peeled more than one patch off a cooling chest, with a curse that did not change a single outcome. He turned and gestured, and cargo drones slid forward with the weightless grace of things that did not care about weather. The racks opened like gills. Names ticked across a display. Rowan felt the subtle proprietary click when the rack recognized his ID and released his kit. The rope had a scent like clean plastic and a little salt. The knife hinge worked smoother than his own because the Academy maintained hinges like hearts. The canister felt too light in his hand. He weighed it and said the number in his head the way he always did. Numbers steadied him. Celix dismissed them to prep, and the crowd dissolved into little eddies of strategy disguised as conversation. An arthropod cadet named Hark from the quarter-span cohort struck arcs in the air with a claw, sketching a burrow plan as if the deck had sand layered over it. A glider cadet lifted her wings just enough to let air run under them and talked about riding the thermal edge of a storm. A vine walker wrapped his own forearm with a practice loop, tightening and loosening to feel friction through bark skin. Rowan moved away from the cluster and found the rack of planetary flora briefs. The files had been scrubbed down to essentials. The Academy had no interest in poetry. He scrolled until a plant profile stopped him. Zephra 5 had columnar succulents with thick skins and internal latticework that distributed stress. Spines angled to throw wind and collect fog. Water content rose deep at night and fell toward the surface in late afternoon. Hollows formed when fungus and wind cooperated along wounded ribs. The brief used words like potential and risk in the measured way of a scientist who did not want a cadet to die and did not intend to stop a cadet from trying. He did not grin when he read about the hollows. He only let his shoulders loosen by a degree that no one else would see. The instinct that made some cadets reach for tech made him reach for biology. He had watched a monsoon turn dirt to mirror and had watched a barrel cactus survive that mirror and 12 weeks of dust after it. He had seen a cracked rib knit itself with new green where a knife had cut years before. He had slept once, as a boy, with his back against a living column and had woken with his shirt damp and cool while the air burned. He had not forgotten the smell of it. Plant sweat and dust. A sweetness that did not flatter. The memory was less romance than instruction. He scanned the rest of the brief and locked the useful pieces in place. Skin toughness measured against abrasive load, internal humidity range, known parasites, the acid bite of sap if fiber tore wrong. He imagined a blade going in along a rib seam. He imagined a plug cut to fit. He imagined waking to silence inside a storm. The shuttle ride down was not long enough to finish a thought. Heat built along the hull in a way that made the air smell like pennies. The cadets strapped in as if straps could bind fear. Rowan sat with spine straight and hands open against his thighs. Across the aisle, a glider cadet watched him with a sideways interest that had nothing to do with friendship. She had blue enamel on her wing edges and a scar across a cheek that gave her smile a permanent edge. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked away in a move that said she had already ranked him inside her head and would check the ranking again after the storm. He did not follow the conversation that rippled through the cabin because the conversation was noise to him. He counted seconds under his breath between the shuttle's minor tremors, and when the count shifted, he knew the pilot had met the first of the upper winds that came off the desert like a staircase of invisible fists. Zephra 5 lifted beneath the shuttle as an expanse of pale dune and darker rock like islands surfacing through an ocean. From above, the succulent columns threw long shadows that cross-hatched the ground in a geometry so clean it could have been planned. The landing zone gleamed as a bare scatter of plates bolted into bedrock. The hatch opened before the heat could rise, and the wind came in as a blade that cut sweat into salt. Sand hissed along the deck and gathered at ankle bones. The smell of this place hit him from 2 directions at once, old dust that had learned every shape of wind and a faint green breath from the plants that stood against it. He felt, without indulging the word, the tug of recognition. The instructors walked the line one last time. Core checked seals on canisters and tugged ropes to see who had tied something while bored and who had not. Celix spoke the window again and the time marks for telemetry scans. She looked at faces as if she photographed each one, not because she would need a picture, but because memory had to work quickly in the field. The sun had started to lean. Shadows grew a little brighter at their edges as if the ground had polished them. Somewhere to the south, a ribbon of darker air moved fast, too far yet to make anyone nervous who did not know that speed at a distance was the only warning a desert gave. Rowan stepped off the plate and into sand that took his weight and then gave it back with interest. The grit rasped against the leather of his boots. He kept his eyes down just long enough to feel the grain size and then lifted them to measure distance to the nearest column. The plant rose 3 times his height. Ribs like fluted stone, spines catching light and throwing it in tiny knives. Wind replaced silence with the kind of constant talk that wore down thought if a mind let it. He did not let it. He walked with a pace that wasted nothing, out beyond the first ring of columns where cadets bickered over angles and knots, beyond the low lee of a rock where an arthropod had already started to dig a pit, with a confidence borrowed from ancestors who dug in different sands under different skies. He counted steps and breaths and the number of ribs per column. He tapped a spine with the back of his knife and read the tone through steel as if the plant had a voice pitched just for him. The brief had said hollows formed where injury and wind conspired. He did not need a hollow yet. He needed a candidate that would not torque under gusts and would not split under vibration overnight. He circled a column with a base as thick as a shuttle tire and watched the pattern of sand at its foot. The eddies told him it broke the wind clean. He found a scar 3 hand widths above his shoulder, old and sealed, the tissue around it denser and lighter in color. He pressed his palm flat against it and felt a coolness that was not an illusion. He imagined lever and wedge. He imagined a plug cut to suit a narrow shoulder and the gentle force required to reseat it without tearing the fibers that would become his door. He took his hand away. He looked up. The sun had a mean grin to it, and the sky had started to whiten with heat at the horizon. Somewhere behind him, laughter rose too high and too fast. The laughter that meant fear had found a voice. He did not turn to watch. He would have to move before the first gust front made angles lie and distances stretch. He would have to cut before sap pressure climbed toward the surface in evening cool and made a simple door into a bloody mess. He would have to drink before his tongue learned the new grit of this moon and turned excuses into mistakes. He wiped his palms on his thighs and checked the rope again, running the line through his fingers as if a story lived in the braid. He tasted salt where the wind blew it off his upper lip. He breathed once, deep enough to hurt a little, and let the sound of that breath anchor him. The storm would come. It would come whether he moved or stood still. He bent to mark sand with the heel of his hand and began to map the night he intended to survive. Rowan moved farther into the desert, the sun's weight pressing down harder with every step. The shadows of the columns he passed were shrinking, losing the long edges they had carried in the early afternoon. The air was already dry enough to scrape at his throat, and each breath tasted faintly metallic. He kept his movements efficient, conserving the water in his canister for when he would need it most. Around him, the terrain shifted from loose dune ridges to a flatter, more compacted stretch where the sand was laced with fine gravel, giving him better footing. In the distance, to his left, a pair of glider cadets worked together to lash their wing frames into a slanted wall, hoping to ride out the storm behind it. He didn't linger on them. Structures like that were too fragile, too exposed, and the wind here was known for turning anything lightweight into shrapnel. He scanned the horizon, marking the positions of the tallest cacti. Some grew in small clusters, others stood alone like sentinels, each ribbed and bristling. The plant he had chosen earlier was still within reach, but he wanted to make certain it was the best option. He approached a second candidate, slightly shorter but with thicker ribs and fewer visible scars. He tapped its outer skin with the back of his knife and listened. The tone was duller, the sound absorbed rather than resonant. That meant the flesh inside was denser and possibly less hollow, not ideal for what he intended. He moved on without hesitation. Time was a currency here, and he had no interest in wasting it. The wind shifted slightly, brushing against his right side. It wasn't yet the leading edge of the storm, but it carried a hint of cooler air from the direction of the low ridges beyond the landing zone. He knew that was the first sign. The desert was telling him it was beginning to move. He adjusted his route to circle back toward his chosen column, stepping carefully over low thorn growth that hid in shallow hollows. As he walked, his eyes caught movement. A vine-walker cadet, low to the ground, wrapping himself in coils of his own plant-like limbs to anchor against a boulder. The alien's bark-textured skin was already catching sand like a shield. Rowan nodded in silent acknowledgement, but didn't slow down. The storm wouldn't care who noticed whom. When he reached his column, the sun had lowered just enough to deepen the shadows around its base. He walked around it again, checking for signs of weakness, splits in the ribs, signs of infestation, anything that could compromise its structure in high wind. He found none. The scar he had seen earlier remained solid and pale, its edges dry and unyielding. He took the knife from his belt, pressing the blade gently into the seam between two ribs to test resistance. The plant skin was tough, more like layered leather than bark. He applied more pressure, letting the blade work slowly rather than forcing it. Sap welled up, thick and clear, with a faint green scent that carried even in the dry air. He knew better than to let it get on his skin. The brief had warned about irritation, so he kept his hands away from the cut. Once the seam was breached, he carved a line no wider than his shoulders, moving deliberately to avoid damaging the internal fibers that would serve as insulation. The sound inside the cactus changed as he worked, becoming more hollow, more open, confirming that there was a cavity large enough to serve his purpose. He widened the opening at the base just enough to allow him to slip through later without having to force his way in during the storm. The smell inside was stronger now, damp and cool, a stark contrast to the heat outside. He stepped back, letting the sap slow before cutting further. With the initial cut made, he needed a plug, a piece of the outer skin that could be used to reseal the entrance from inside. He worked at the scar tissue around the opening, shaping a curved panel that matched the contour of the ribs. It took precision to make sure it would fit snugly without leaving gaps for sand to blow in. Once it was free, he set it aside in the shadow, wiping the blade on the sand to keep it clean. The panel was heavier than it looked, a sign that the cactus still held plenty of water deep inside. That was good. The more hydrated the plant, the more it would resist drying out and becoming brittle under the storm's assault. He inspected the inside of the cavity by leaning close and letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The walls were thick, lined with fibrous material that would act as padding against the wind's vibrations. Moisture clung to the inner surface in tiny droplets, proof that the plant's water stores were intact. He reached in and touched the wall lightly. The surface was cool enough to be noticeable even against the dry heat on his skin. This was the right choice. As he prepared to make final adjustments, a sudden burst of wind swept past, carrying fine sand that rattled softly against the cactus ribs. It wasn't yet strong enough to obscure vision, but it was a reminder that time was no longer on his side. The light had shifted further, the sun dropping lower toward the jagged horizon. He could already see a faint haze in the far distance, the storm front creeping closer. The haze was darker at its base, a thick, roiling line that would become a wall when it reached them. He worked quickly now, smoothing the edges of the opening from the inside so the plug would fit without resistance. He tested it twice, slipping it into place and pulling it back out to ensure it could be secured quickly once he was inside. The seal was good, not airtight, but close enough to keep out the majority of the sand. From the inside, the plug blended into the natural ribs, making the entrance almost invisible unless one knew where to look. Rowan paused for a moment, taking a drink from his canister. Not too much, just enough to wet his mouth and clear the taste of dust. He scanned the horizon again. The other cadets were still scrambling with their shelters, some stacking rocks, others digging shallow pits. None of them seemed to be looking for anything alive to work with. That didn't surprise him. Most had grown up on worlds where survival meant building over, not working within. He let the thought pass. His concern was not their methods, only his own. The temperature was beginning to shift in that subtle way deserts had, the heat thinning, the air taking on a sharper bite as evening crept closer. That shift meant the cactus would start drawing water toward its surface in preparation for the cooler night. He could use that to his advantage. Inside, the humidity would rise slightly, keeping the air breathable and cool while the storm raged outside. He ran his fingers once more along the inside wall, feeling the texture, memorizing the space. When the time came, he wouldn't want to fumble in darkness. Another gust hit, stronger this time, bending the taller spines on the cactus and sending a sharp hiss through the air. Rowan knew the real wind wasn't far behind now. He picked up the panel and leaned it against the entrance, ready to be set in place the moment the storm arrived. He had just enough time to gather a few armfuls of loose cactus fiber from a nearby collapsed column, not alive, just dried remnants, which he could use as bedding and additional insulation inside. He tucked the fibers into the cavity, arranging them to cover the base where he would lie. The sky to the west had deepened into a muted orange, the first stars barely visible in the thinning light. The storm haze was no longer a distant blur. It had texture now, layers of rolling grit and fractured light, moving with a speed that made the desert seem to lean toward it. Rowan crouched at the entrance of the cactus, every motion measured, every decision already made. The preparation was over. The next phase would be the wait, and the storm would decide how long that lasted. Rowan waited until the light had nearly vanished from the horizon before making his final move. The air had turned sharp, carrying fine particles that hissed softly against his skin. The storm front now loomed like a living wall, its upper edge bleeding into the night sky, its base so dense it seemed to crawl across the desert floor. A low, unbroken roar came from within it, a sound that bypassed the ears and pressed straight into the chest. He stepped to the entrance of the cactus, ran one last check along the edges of the cut he had made, and slid inside. The fibrous walls closed around him, narrowing the world to the cool, green-smelling space. He pulled the curved panel into place, pressing it firmly until it seated against the ribs, locking with the precision of a natural joint. Only a faint seam remained, hidden from any casual glance outside. Inside, the darkness was complete, but not oppressive. He could feel the air, heavy with moisture, moving slowly in and out through the tiny vent hole he had left near the top. The fibers muffled the outside sound, turning the roar of the storm into a deep, distant hum. He crouched and arranged the dried cactus fibers into a low mound, settling himself on it so that his back rested against the curved wall. The material under him was springy, insulating him from the cooler air at the base. He kept the rope coiled loosely in his lap, not because he expected to need it, but because habits built in training were difficult to set aside. The first real gust struck soon after he sealed the entrance. The cactus swayed, the motion slow and deliberate, as if it had been built for this exact purpose. The sound changed, becoming a rapid-fire hiss as sand began to blast against the outer skin. Each impact was softened by the plant's layered surface, diffusing the force before it could transmit inward. Rowan closed his eyes and let his breathing match the rhythm of the sway, counting silently to track the intervals between stronger bursts. When one gust lingered longer than the rest, rattling the spines in a wild chorus, he knew the main body of the storm had arrived. The temperature inside rose slightly, the plant's stored heat radiating inward as the wind stripped warmth from its surface. Rowan took slow sips from his canister, careful not to overdrink. The air carried a faint, earthy sweetness from the cactus's interior, almost like damp soil after rain. His mind cataloged every sensation, not as a distraction, but as a way to stay alert. Storms on worlds like Zephra 5 could shift without warning. If the cactus took structural damage, he would need to react instantly. Minutes stretched into hours. The outside world was reduced to sound and vibration. The relentless scrape of sand, the deep groan of larger gusts, and occasionally the sharp staccato rattle when debris struck the spines. Once, there was a loud, heavy thud against the ribs, strong enough to make the entire column shiver. Rowan tightened his grip on the rope but didn't move. The cactus held, its fibers dispersing the shock. Somewhere beyond the plant's walls, the other cadets were enduring their own battles. Shelters being ripped apart, pits filling with suffocating sand, armor plates vibrating until they split. He pushed the thought aside. What happened beyond his walls was beyond his control now. His focus returned to the slow rhythm of the sway, using it as a clock. Every few minutes, the angle would shift slightly as the wind direction changed. The plant adjusted naturally, its base anchored deep enough to ride out gusts from multiple directions. Rowan leaned his head back, letting the cool interior press against his hair. The quiet inside was deceptive. He knew that the storm outside was chaos, that visibility was likely reduced to nothing, and that even the strongest cadets would be struggling to keep their lungs clear of grit. At one point, the air inside grew noticeably cooler, enough to make him shift his position and pull his knees closer to conserve warmth. This was expected. Desert nights could drop to near freezing once the sun was gone. The cactus walls insulated him, but not perfectly. He took one of the nutrient bars from his pack, chewing slowly to keep his body generating heat. The taste was bland, but the act of eating kept his focus steady. Hours into the storm, a new sound entered the mix, a deep, low moan that didn't match the wind's usual voice. He froze, listening. It came again, longer this time, and with a faint vibration in the wall behind him. Something large was moving outside, slow but heavy enough to transmit its steps through the sand. The sound passed, fading into the constant hiss. Perhaps it was a native predator displaced by the storm, seeking shelter of its own. He remained still, trusting that the plant's seamless exterior and his lack of scent in the open air would keep him invisible. As the night deepened, exhaustion began to press at the edges of his awareness. The steady sway and the muted roar acted almost like a lullaby, but he fought the pull toward sleep. He allowed himself short, timed rests, closing his eyes for 100 counted breaths before opening them again, ensuring he stayed aware of any change in the plant's motion or the sound outside. The rhythm of the storm was beginning to change, the gusts coming less frequently, the constant hiss softening as if the sand supply in the upper air was dwindling. At what he judged to be the final hours before dawn, he noticed a subtle shift in the light filtering through the vent hole. It was faint, but enough to tell him the worst of the storm was likely over. The plant still swayed, but more gently now, the movements shorter and slower. The temperature inside began to climb slightly as the first weak warmth of morning brushed the desert. He stayed in place, resisting the urge to check outside too early. Storms like this could have trailing bands of high wind that caught the unwary. He took another drink from the canister, finishing what little water remained. His body felt steady, his breathing unlabored, his skin free of the grit that would have coated him in any other shelter. He adjusted the plug in preparation for removal, pressing against its edges to make sure the fibers hadn't shifted under the wind's pressure. It held firm, the cactus having done its job perfectly. He allowed himself a single deep breath, filling his lungs with the moist, plant-scented air one last time before the desert would reclaim it. Soon, he would step out into the aftermath and see what had become of the others who had faced the storm without the sanctuary he had chosen. Rowan waited until the cactus had gone completely still before moving. The faint morning light filtering through the small vent hole had strengthened to a pale gold, and the muffled roar of the storm had faded into a long, empty silence. He placed one hand flat against the interior wall, feeling no more vibration under his palm, only the steady, damp coolness of the plant's inner flesh. Taking a slow breath, he reached for the curved panel he had used to seal the entrance. The edges of the cut still fit tight, but the fibers had softened slightly from the humidity inside, making it easier to ease the plug outward without tearing the skin. A thin shaft of blinding light knifed into the chamber as the panel shifted, illuminating motes of dust that hung in the cool air like tiny gold sparks. He pressed the plug forward, and it slid free with a faint, sticky sound. The desert outside was unrecognizable from the place he had entered the night before. The sand was sculpted into jagged ridges and shallow basins, marked by the sharp, chaotic signatures of wind that had clawed at the surface for hours. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, still hazy near the horizon where the remnants of the storm drifted away in lazy spirals. The air carried a lingering sharpness, each breath stinging faintly in the nose and throat, but it was a clean sting, the sign that the worst had passed. Rowan stepped out, stretching stiff muscles and letting the warmth of the early sun begin to work into his skin. His boots sank slightly into the freshly shifted sand, which was still cool from the night. As his eyes adjusted, he began scanning the area for any sign of the other cadets. At first, there was only emptiness, no movement, no voices, only the faint hiss of sand sliding down the faces of the new ridges. Then he spotted the first shape, a glider cadet crouched in the partial shelter of a rock outcropping, his wings folded tight, dusted with grit. The alien's posture was rigid, and his head hung low, but he was alive. A few meters beyond him, a vine walker lay half buried in the sand, slowly pulling himself free, his bark-textured skin scarred by the abrasive wind. Rowan moved toward neither of them yet. This was not a rescue drill, and interference could mean disqualification. The instructors had their own protocols for post-storm recovery. The landing zone's direction was marked by the faint glint of metal from the anchored plates, barely visible over the reshaped dunes. Rowan began making his way toward it, pacing himself to avoid overheating too quickly. Each step revealed more of the storm's damage. Half-collapsed pits lay scattered in the flatter areas, some still partially filled with drifts that had swallowed entire shelters. A shattered wing frame lay twisted in the sand, its edges splintered where the wind had snapped it. He passed a cluster of rocks where an arthropod cadet had tried to anchor a barricade. The frame was gone, the ropes frayed to useless threads, and a pair of the cadet's tools were half buried nearby. He didn't see the cadet himself, which meant he had either made it back to the landing zone or been retrieved during the night. The further he walked, the more he noticed the silence. In the Academy's simulated environments, there was always some residual hum, the hidden machinery of controlled trials. Here, there was nothing but the wind's faint afterbreath and the occasional creak of cooling metal when the sun hit debris. The absence of sound felt heavier than the storm itself, as if the desert were still holding its breath. Rowan's own breathing was steady, but he was aware of the subtle rasp in his throat from the dry air. He would need water soon, though he had rationed well. When the landing zone came into full view, he saw movement at last. A pair of instructors in environmental armor stood near the edge, watching the desert through polarized visors. A rescue drone hovered a short distance away, its sensors sweeping in slow arcs. One of the instructors raised a hand in acknowledgement as Rowan approached, but didn't speak. This was still part of the evaluation. Every cadet who returned was silently judged on posture, pace, and condition. Rowan kept his stride even, showing no sign of strain, and came to a stop within the marked perimeter. He removed his canister from his belt and handed it over for inspection, a standard part of the post-trial procedure to check how resources had been used. The instructor weighed it, nodded once, and returned it without comment. From his vantage point near the plates, Rowan could see the first small groups of surviving cadets emerging from the dunes. Some moved slowly, their movements jerky with exhaustion. Others carried visible damage to their gear, split armor, shredded fabric, scorched skin from wind friction. A few had to be guided in by drones, their pace too unsteady to maintain on their own. The difference in conditions was stark. Those who had relied on hastily built shelters looked worn and unsteady, their eyes squinting against the morning light as if they had spent the entire night in constant battle. Rowan's own body ached, but it was the dull, manageable ache of muscles held in one position for hours, not the deep fatigue of fighting an unstoppable force. The instructors moved among the returning cadets with the efficient detachment of medics who knew which wounds were urgent and which could wait. Minor injuries were logged and left for later treatment. Major ones were stabilized immediately. A glider cadet who had lost consciousness during the storm was laid out near the edge of the landing zone, a drip line feeding into a port on his arm. The vinewalker Rowan had seen earlier finally staggered into the zone, leaning heavily on a length of twisted metal like a walking stick. His bark-like skin was peeled away in patches, revealing the pale, sensitive layers beneath. The sun climbed higher, washing away the last lingering haze and exposing the full breadth of the desert's transformation. The ridges and basins the storm had carved would not last. In a few days, the wind would sculpt them into something else entirely. But for now, they stood as evidence of the night's violence. Rowan watched as the instructors recorded scans of the terrain, no doubt to compare with pre-storm maps for future trials. He kept his eyes forward as Commander Celix approached. She stopped in front of him, her gaze traveling from his boots, still dusted but intact, up to his face. Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes that told him she had already reviewed his telemetry. She didn't ask what shelter he had used. That would come later in the debrief, but she gave the faintest nod before moving on to inspect the others. For the Academy, acknowledgement was a currency, and even a nod from Celix was worth more than a dozen spoken praises. By the time the last cadets straggled in, the sun was fully above the horizon, and the heat was beginning to press down again. The instructors began herding the group toward the waiting transport shuttle. Rowan glanced back once toward the cactus that had been his refuge. From this distance, it was just another green column among dozens, indistinguishable to anyone who didn't know its secret. He allowed himself a final moment of quiet satisfaction before turning away and stepping onto the shuttle's ramp. The trial wasn't over yet. The debrief and analysis would determine the true measure of each cadet's performance. But he knew that whatever came next, the desert had already given him its answer. The shuttle's interior was quiet on the return flight, filled with the heavy stillness that followed any trial where exhaustion lingered deeper than words. Rowan sat in the middle row, his pack resting on his knees, the faint scent of cactus still clinging to his hands. Outside the small viewport, the desert moon was already shrinking into the distance, its ochre surface softened by the thin veil of the atmosphere. He watched it fade without sentimentality, only a measured awareness that this landscape had been both his test and his shelter. The ride was short, and the low hum of the engines carried him back into the familiar gravity of the Academy before the silence could turn into reflection. When the shuttle settled onto the platform, the cadets disembarked in single file, boots ringing against the composite deck. Instructors were already waiting at the edge of the landing zone, datapads in hand, ready to begin the post-trial processing. No one was allowed to return to quarters without a full medical scan and a performance debrief. Rowan stepped onto the diagnostic plate when his name was called, standing still as a thin lattice of blue light passed over him. The scan confirmed his vitals were steady, hydration within acceptable limits, and no external injuries beyond minor superficial abrasions. The medic glanced at the readings, gave a curt nod, and sent him toward the debrief chamber. The chamber was dim, its walls curved and lined with recessed displays. Each cadet had a designated seat, spaced far enough apart to prevent whispering. Above them, the main screen cycled through storm telemetry, shifting patterns of wind velocity, temperature gradients, and impact data gathered from drones. Rowan's telemetry file appeared briefly, a series of stable heart rate graphs and minimal environmental alerts. It drew a faint murmur from a pair of cadets seated near the back, though neither spoke loud enough for an instructor to intervene. When Commander Celix entered, the room fell silent without her having to ask. She began by reviewing the storm's timeline, pointing out critical shifts where cadets had either adapted or failed to adjust. The footage that followed was blunt and unfiltered. Collapsed shelters, rescues in near-zero visibility, and the blunt admission of fatalities in past years when conditions had been even worse. She moved through the material without dramatics, letting the facts carry their own weight. Then, one by one, she called each cadet forward for an individual assessment. When Rowan's turn came, he stood and walked to the front without hesitation. Celix met his gaze, then activated the recording of his personal camera feed. The first half showed him moving through the dunes, methodically selecting his site. The rest was nearly static, a view of dim green walls, occasional adjustments of gear, and the subtle motion of the cactus swaying under the wind. She paused the feed at the point where the storm reached peak intensity, the telemetry overlay showing stable vitals and negligible exposure. "You identified a structural refuge that required no reinforcement," she said, her tone even. "Minimal energy expenditure, maximum protection. Explain your selection process." He gave a concise account, detailing his observation of plant structure, the use of natural humidity, and the sealing of the entrance. He did not embellish, nor did he omit the risks, the possibility of structural failure, the hazard of internal pests, and the danger of becoming trapped if the plant collapsed. Celix listened without interruption, then recorded her remarks into the file. "Creative application of terrestrial survival knowledge to an alien biome. High adaptability, effective risk management, passing score with commendation." She dismissed him with a slight incline of her head, and he returned to his seat. The rest of the debrief moved quickly, with scores ranging from passable to poor. Those who had survived by sheer endurance rather than strategic planning received lower marks, their struggles serving as examples of what not to repeat in the field. The glider cadet who had endured the storm behind a rock outcropping passed, but barely. The vine walker who had been half buried failed, his shelter deemed inadequate from the start. When the session ended, the cadets were free to return to quarters. Rowan stepped out into the Academy's main thoroughfare, the artificial lighting almost jarring after the natural extremes of Zephra 5. The air here was cool, scrubbed clean, and utterly predictable. He walked without hurry, the hum of the corridor systems beneath his feet a reminder of the controlled environment he now moved through. The trial already felt distant, but the lessons it had reinforced stayed sharp in his mind. Word of his method spread faster than he expected. By the time he reached the dormitory wing, 2 cadets from another cohort stopped him in the hall, asking if the rumors were true, that he had slept inside a cactus during the storm. He gave a brief nod and kept walking, uninterested in explaining the details. Let them speculate. The Academy thrived on stories, and sometimes the story mattered more than the truth when it came to reputation. Later, alone in his quarters, he unpacked his kit. The rope went back to its place on the wall, the knife cleaned and oiled before being sheathed again. The canister was empty, its surface faintly rough from the fine grit that had found its way into every seam. He set it on the desk as a quiet reminder, not a trophy, but a marker of a decision made under pressure that had worked exactly as intended. The cactus was still standing out there on Zephra 5, indistinguishable among the countless others. Its ribs would seal the cut over time, the scar blending into the rest of its surface until even an experienced eye would pass over it without pause. Yet for Rowan, that column would always hold the memory of a night when the desert had offered him shelter in its own language, and he had been prepared to listen. The Academy would log his performance in the cold, clinical terms of survival metrics. But he knew that the real measure was simpler. He had faced the storm on its own ground, and when morning came, he had walked out intact. That was enough.